Hello, everybody, and I'm really very delighted to welcome Lindsey Fielder Cook to talk about the United Nations and Cop26, an insider view. So over to you, Lindsey.
Thank you very much, Trish and Sarah, and thank you for this chance to speak to you. I haven't been to Skye for 35 years, but 35 years ago I was on a bicycle, one on the ferry, which I know is now a bridge, and cycled around your beautiful island, and I do hope to return soon. I'm so impressed by this conference and what you have all put together. And I know that you have already had many sessions and are quite informed, but I will try to speak slowly and to give the detail that is not too overwhelming, and hope that it is also inspiring. As you all know from the work you've done so far, there is a great deal of urgency. We have this very smaller chance to hold temperature rise to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We are on track for a rise by 2100 of almost 4.8, and that doesn't have to happen, but the time is now to ensure that it doesn't get to that place. And the difference between the two, as a climate scientist once shared with me, the difference between those two temperature rises are from the manageable to the unmanageable or the unimaginable. We're going to talk today about the United Nations and the Cop26 as an insider view. I'll speak for about 15, maximum 20 minutes. And just to say, I am called, my title is the representative for climate change at the Quaker United Nations office. We are an international NGO. We have offices in New York and Geneva, and we have supported the United Nations on peace and justice issues since the 1950s. Previously receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, the Quakers then decided to support the UN and were one of the first civil society groups there. And my work is called the Human Impacts of Climate Change, and we focus on the multilateral, so the international. We approach climate change as a peace and justice issue, and we work and approach our work as grounded on Quaker values. So there is something slightly connected with the spiritual side, not just as a political NGO. Just to give some background, I've been in this work with the Quaker United Nations office for 8 years, but since we're talking about the UN, I first fell in love with the international approach in 1986 after being at Durham University and studying politics. And I worked in New York at the Kino office and really felt that I was a citizen, not just of a country. I was born in New York City, studied in Britain, but I was a sort of citizen of the planet. And I've always loved working with other cultures, other people together in a room. But I wasn't interested in the environment at all. I was interested in politics and conflict resolution. I worked in Northern Ireland initially with inner city communities, children, different Protestant and Catholic coming together. After Kino, I worked for the Israeli occupied territories as a teacher in 1986, 87, 88, the Intifada hit. And from being a teacher in the West Bank, I then went to work for the United Nations there into refugee protection because of the conflict that was happening. And that really started my work with the UN and a real attempt to find ways forward on that global way. I then returned to the Israeli occupied territories in the mid-1990s, again with the United Nations, to work in Gaza on the Oslo Peace Agreement. And in between that, I worked in Somalia for the United Nations during the famine and on human rights as a humanitarian officer. And then also in the former Yugoslavia as a human rights officer there when the war was just breaking out and we were identifying the first mass graves. So my work was really humanitarian, human rights. And I then sort of went into the UK in marriage and having children, and took 10 years really to not only be with my children, but to also stop for a bit and look around. And that was when I started to think about what is the real challenge of my generation, much more beyond the things that I cared so much about in terms of conflict resolution. But it was when I started to look at myself in a mirror and started to look at what are we doing to the planet and how does that affect our and our children's and next generation's futures. And so I went back to graduate work to study climate change and sustainable development. And as I said, in the last 8 years, I've been with CUNO. I'm just going to bring up some slides to show you some pictures, so you get a taste of well, what we do and where we do it. So just briefly, our work at the international level. So the first thing we started was at the International Climate Change negotiations, which is the COP. But during the year, also supporting their work on climate change, what we call the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. That's the place that puts together these COPs. So on your left here, you have one of the earlier negotiating rooms. You can see that's with the 190 plus countries. The European Union is representing the 27 member states. And then you have individual countries as well. And we worked there and continue to with something called quiet diplomacy. We bring together negotiators from a diverse group of countries to speak off the record on sensitive issues, maximum 20 people. And we continue to do that. The 5th session we've had in COVID is in 2 weeks. And it includes the high-level negotiators to talk openly in ways that they have less chance to do in other spaces. And this work continues because they keep asking for it. And so that is what we do, but we also do for the COPs and for the climate change work, for the negotiations. We work on what we call the peace and justice side. We work on loss and damage. We work on those areas to say, where is the human impact affected? How can the Indigenous people's voices be stronger in this process? How can finance be delivered? And I'll go into more on that later for this COP, but this is the peace and justice side of how do we do this fairly and correctly and right and ambitiously. The other work that we do on the right is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. We are an observer there. We just were in the recent report. We're expert reviewers. We are one of the few observers that speak. We spoke 10 times in the meeting the other week. And again, pushing for clear and reality-focused language on what's happening. Also in the IPCC, trying to work with states that are aggressive to the science to try to tone down what they may be trying to do to take science out of the summary that you will receive, although you can read the 1,000 pages, nobody's taking that information out, but the summary can be changed as long as it doesn't affect the integrity of the science. But there is a process which needs protection and it needs awareness, and the scientists need our support. The other place we work, and that's down on the right, is the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So we're based in Geneva. And the Human Rights Council is very important for us because it's about the abuses and the violation of human rights. We have a declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's one of the most profound documents in late 1940s, still so relevant to us today. Still a place to talk about urgent climate action as protecting the current and future generations and the most vulnerable now, and avoiding human rights abuses. And that is a space as well for us. But also to talk about what we call human rights-based approaches to climate action, which I'll speak on a little more. And so that's our work. And then of course, grassroots. So we do publications. We've got some links in the chat box. We do publications to support grassroots communities to understand how the international efforts and norms and decisions could strengthen their work in their communities, because most countries are not as progressive as some of the resolutions that are being said at the international level. And you need to know what your country's agreed to so that you can then push and pressure your own country delegates about what they've said they'll do and are they doing it in the ground. So I'm just going to, let's see if I can go down a page. Am I able to do that? Yeah. Just briefly, again, here's some pictures. Anyone who's not involved or heard about the planetary boundaries, Google it. It's a fascinating way of looking how everything is connected. And I use that in a lot of my science presentations. You've probably come across this, but it's to relate that everything is connected. Climate change is a symptom of a greater challenge, how to live sustainably and justly on Earth. At the moment, species extinction rates are much more dangerous than the rate of increased temperature rise. However, the increased temperature rise rate is increasingly becoming far more lethal. So this is our time now to help, but never to forget how interconnected what's driving climate change is also driving the other environmental crises. And that includes chemical pollution. And that includes one of the drivers, which is industrial farming, et cetera. And then just on the bottom right, there's a picture of us talking at the IPCC last week, and above when we were pre-COVID allowed to speak in person. And just as a peace and justice issue, we talk about climate justice all the time. Climate justice is about people. It's about acting now. We link it often to the abolition of slavery. The drivers of climate change are very lucrative activities. A few people make a lot of money, and most people are profoundly affected by that. How then do we approach this also as a moral call to conscience? And then I talked about human rights-based approaches. Briefly before we started recording, Trish was talking about making sure that the electricity, which is created through the, I presume, wind turbines in sky, go directly to people in sky. That's what we call decentralized energy systems. What you have around you in different countries are different examples of how renewables can be actually sourced locally and can benefit local communities. And again, it's about power and money. Are your utility companies privately owned? Is the money going to shareholders? Is that wind turbine directly empowering your community? And if so, why not? Who's making the money? So these are questions we ask, and human rights-based approaches are about public participation. They're about protecting Indigenous people's rights, biodiversity, ensuring that human rights are not abused in the climate action we promote, about just transitions to support those whose jobs may be affected if they're working in the fossil fuel community, for example, about peace building, because when you approach it with a protection of rights, you are peace building in a potential conflict. And then just finally, all the amazing things that can come out of a transformation, because the way we are living now, these unsustainable and unjust economic systems and these human activities which are driving climate change, there is such a more healthy way to live. So I'm going to take us out of these slides and I'm going to come back in. Okay. And then I just want to talk about the negotiations. So you've got the COP coming up not far from you. When I first came into a COP in 2013, I felt like I was walking into a lion's den. I cannot underestimate what it's like to have 190 plus countries sitting there talking about what nature is doing in response to our human activities, which is to threaten not only our citizens, but everyone else. And to do that in a way that it's happened because certain countries have benefited now already, right? We are the birthplace in the UK of the Industrial Revolution. We have benefited, developed countries have benefited, and now we're asking other countries not to emit the same, right? So you can imagine the tension in that room and the mistrust, hundreds of years of colonialization, hundreds of years of unjust practices which continue. And now we're supposed to have an agreement. I mean, it is still an incredibly difficult space. But I say that to explain why the Paris Agreement was so extraordinary in getting to that space. And we had something called the Kyoto Protocol, which was an agreement for developed countries that was legally binding to reduce their emissions. However, countries walked out. The US walked out. Canada, when it was doing its tar sands, walked out. The European Union held to its agreements and reduced its emissions as it was asked. But it was not universal for those developed countries. And then, of course, the developing country emissions were increasing now at a rate that even if all developed countries stopped their emissions, we would still have this lethal situation in our face. China is now over a quarter of emissions. How do we do an agreement that brings everyone together, and how do we do that fairly? And that was the Paris Agreement. So what was historical about 2015 was that it was universal. It was legally binding to an extent. I'll go into that. It has the most rights-based language for an environmental treaty in any environmental treaty to date for 2019. So it talked about respecting human rights, the rights of disabled, the rights of indigenous people, right? And it talked about sustainable development again in the preamble, but that language is being used in court cases now to encourage or to legally require more ambition. It was a commitment to pursue a temperature limit to 1.5 Celsius, which was unexpected in 2015. We didn't think they would go that far, and they did it. They had it in the legal section, it's called Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. And it was that developed countries have to lead in finance and mitigation. Now that's so important, and that's not to forget in the Cop26. We are supposed to be leading. The UK and other developed countries are supposed to be leading. So when we're talking about our actions and our emissions, remember to remind everyone that actually developed countries should be leading. Developing countries are also reducing their emissions, but we must not let ourselves get off the hook as if suddenly everybody has to do the same. They're not supposed to in the Paris Agreement. We are supposed to lead. Now, the vulnerabilities of the Paris Agreement. So we talked about Kyoto had targets for emission reductions, legally binding targets. Paris Agreement has what we call nationally determined contributions. They are voluntary. Now, the legally binding side is that they have to, a country like the UK has to submit what we call an NDC, nationally determined contribution. And the next time it submits that, it has to be even stronger. That's the legally binding side. But you could walk in with a very weak voluntary contribution. Military emissions are not included, and emissions from extraction are not included. I guess who put that one in? The fossil fuel countries, right? Not just the UK, even developing countries that have fossil fuels as holding their environment, right? So Norway can pump, or the UK can pump lots of its own oil, and it's not included in its NDC, it's who burns it. So that's another vulnerable side. Why don't we include what we actually extract so that we can commit to reducing our extraction? Issue for the UK right now. So it's the volunteer side, the voluntary side. And the reason that happened in the Paris Agreement, the reason they couldn't get sort of legally binding targets aligned with the IPCC is that a number of countries wouldn't have signed the Paris Agreement. And after the Kyoto experience, the need to have everyone in that room was so important. And we had a situation where the US finally really wanted to sign it, but the US was represented by President Obama, and he knew Congress would not accept a new treaty coming in. So he had to have a treaty that he legally under his powers could sign, but didn't have to pass to Congress. That's why, one of the reasons why that Paris Agreement has shall where Obama could get that through, but should where it would keep him from having to bring it to Congress. So there was a compromise there. It wasn't just the US, but there was a major desire to get the US on board as one of the highest emitting or the highest emitting developed country. So coming into the COP26, talked about we are the birth of the industrial. I'm married to a Brit, so it's my adopted country. Developed countries have to take the lead. And the main focus, this is going to sound a bit technical, but you asked me to speak about the COP, so here we go. These are the areas that we would consider success. Now, this is in the negotiating room. I know it's not people on the street, but in the negotiating room, this is what we want to see. The rule book on how to implement the Paris Agreement is not complete. And there are a number of things that we need to agree in this COP to make it complete. And that's important for trust because it's been 5 years now. One of them is called Article 6. Article 6 is about carbon markets. The carbon markets are not everybody's interest, and we don't support carbon markets, particularly as the most effective or fair form of climate action, but it is, carbon markets are for some countries important. They need to get those clarified to make sure that the guidelines make it effective and you don't double count emissions. They also need to agree on common timeframes. And that's about, it sounds, what's common? Well, the common time frame is every time we bring in a new NDC, do we bring it in every 5 years? Do we do it every 10 years? And if we do it every 10 years, then well, maybe it's too late by then, right? So that's really important for ambition. And the transparency, are we using the same ways to calculate our emissions? So these sound very technical, but they're actually very important, because in the end, the guidelines could lead to a very weak reporting or a very tight reporting. And then we know what we're dealing with. The other thing is adaptation. We have in the Paris Agreement, we have this global goal for adaptation, but adaptation is often seen as a developing country issue, and it's not given the support that developed countries should. So we need to support adaptation as the UK, but we also need to support loss and damage. And loss and damage is about the people who are affected now, regardless of what happens. And that is probably the strongest moral call in the Cop26. And it's the loss and damage is what the developed countries kind of want to avoid, because they don't want what we call liability. But there are so many ways to finance support for people already affected by our insufficient action. Things like carbon taxes, things like a Tobin tax, a finance tax. There are so many ways you can tax carbon at extraction, those who actually pump it, who make the money. There's so many ways we could be internationally channeling money to those who are most affected now. And those discussions need to be encouraged by our politicians who say, well, I can't tax my community more. No, don't tax people on the Isle of Skye. Tax the people who are actually extracting that oil. The other thing is mitigation. The NDCs are not strong enough. We have got to increase our NDCs, and particularly developed countries, but also those developing countries who have more of a responsibility in what they're doing. And there are a number of countries that I would say are pumping more per person than even in a developed country. So on that level, what is the responsibility we're taking for what we're doing? But again, with the Paris Agreement framework that's fair, because the developed countries have to lead. And finally, finance. Now, finance, I shouldn't say finally, it's the biggest thing really at this COP. Since Copenhagen, so 2009, they've been talking about 100 billion a year by 2020. Now it's 2021. The 100 billion a year isn't there. The OECD would say, but there's 80 billion. But often, if you look at the specifics, a lot of that is private sector money going in to invest in a country. But when it's private sector money going in to invest in a country, there's no control of that country, of that money, and they don't actually guide where that money goes. And the understanding more was 100 billion that's put into, for example, what they call the Green Climate Fund, that where countries could then use that money for what they feel is needed. And it's grants, not loans. So although that's not on paper, it's what's the right thing to do, especially after COVID, when we've seen that if you want money, you will find it. And then a lot of the money too is if a poorer country is going to implement its NDC, well, it doesn't have the money to do it. Where's that money going to come from? And we have a responsibility, because a lot of what we're dealing with now is dealing with emissions from the past. So those are the things at the COP. And then just to finish off, expectations. So while all these negotiators are sitting in this room looking really tense, and we're all sitting in this room looking really tense, outside civil society is saying, do something, banging on doors, praying, acting. The COP is actually an incredible place for networking, for gaining awareness. I mean, what you're doing right now is because there's going to be a COP in Glasgow, right? It's so powerful what these COPs also do for us as civil society. So while what's happening in the COP may itself sound kind of boring, it's important for a global framework for action. And then on the outside, everything we're doing, what you're doing now, what we'll do when we're at the COP on the streets, that's about gaining awareness of how urgent the situation is and how we want to act. So I say that because I think the COPs can be exhausting, emotionally. Well, they always are for me. I don't know. I always feel at the end that wasn't never enough. And yet every year we're trying to do more. And it's never perfect. But what I would say is, when I look at what's happening in the UK to build up an awareness of this COP, it's unbelievable. It's so exciting, and use this. And I'll finish off something that I read to the Quaker yearly meeting this year about climate action, about a UK NDC. And I said, examine your UK climate policies. Do they prioritize rapid reduction of fossil fuel use, a rapid increase of renewable energy? Do they prioritize sustainable economic and agriculture systems, reduce consumption and integrate human rights, in line with pursuing a 1.5 temperature rise limit? Or do they promote false solutions, maintain the norm, pump emissions into the ground, carbon capture storage, plant trees as carbon offsets, expand airports, a new coal mine or an oil field, or ship unrecycled waste to pollute some other country? The UK right now is amongst one of the most unequal societies in Europe. It's really important that we look outside and see how other countries do things, because our society in the last decade particularly has increased inequality, and inequality is also part of how we have a fair approach to climate action. And that also might want to look at our democracy. I know in Scotland itself, you have proportional representation on your local side, but imagine if you had that nationally, because then you would start having voices like you see in other countries where parties which really are acting for certain green policies, for example. And I live in Bonn often, so I look at the Green Party there. It's taken decades, but it's really taking, they may even have a Green Party chancellor. So not to say the Green Party is everything, but getting those policies in and having competition and having voices feel like when you vote, it really makes a difference. So I just share that. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. I mean, a tour de force, really incredible. In how many minutes, I don't know, 30 minutes, less than 30 minutes. You have just covered so much ground and left us with so much to think about. But even more important, you've given us some real pointers for action now. This is a wonderful way to have our last talk in the FAISH, because it is a call for action, and we will act. We are acting, and we will continue to build on what we're doing. Yeah, I've made various notes. I won't, but the last thing you said about the Green Party, well, the Green Party in Scotland will have power. It will have power. And there will be ministers from the Green Party because of this wonderful, it's not a coalition, but it is a kind of collaboration. And so here in Scotland, the scene is set. We have all the models that are necessary for the future, and we are going to crack climate change. And it won't be a change for the worse, it will be a change for the better. We are going to have a most beautiful planet. So you heard it here first. Thank you again. Thank you again.
Thank you all.
Sarah. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think we can